These are the quiz questions I'm going to answer over the lymphatic system and immunity, and I have a diagram to support my answer. So question number 1, describe the major differences and similarities of the innate defense system and adaptive defense system. So innate defense system and adaptive defense system both are part of our immune system that protects our body from those infections or disease. So, but innate defense system is just our first and second line of defense. I mean, they are just very basic direct defense system. So they just respond like a pretty fast, like in hours, and they are effective quite broadly. And adaptive defense system is just the third line of our defense. So it's rather it takes time. It responds slowly, like in days, but pretty precise to certain pathogens we are dealing with, and that has a long memory. So they have these memory cells that when we are exposed to the specific antigen, so they will just keep memorize those what they are, and they will remember that, and they will be able to produce this specific antibody to fight against those antigens anytime later. So we can just have those capabilities to deal with those certain antigen via the adaptive defense system. And question number 2, what are some examples of our innate defense system and what are some examples of our adaptive defense system? So the examples of our innate system could be like inflammation. So that is the tissue response to an injury or some wounds by producing like a swelling or redness or pains. So the white blood cell will just coming to this wounds area, so to fight off those injuries, the pathogens, so they can remove the pathogen. So that's the like a first line of defense. And also the fevers, like they just rising at body temperature, so they can kill certain pathogens as well. So those would be the examples of innate defense system. And regarding the adaptive defense system, well, we have like a B cells or T cells. So those cells that like a B cells, they are producing those antibodies, and T cells will just will recognize those cells and destroy them directly. So those are slow, but they work pretty precisely to certain pathogens. And question number 3, compare and contrast B cells and T cells of the immune system. So again, those are both of our part of our adaptive defense system, but B cells are like antibody. They are just responding via this antibody. They are just produce those antibody, and they are acting indirectly. They are not dealing with it directly, those pathogens directly, but they are just producing the antibody, and those antibody will kill the pathogen. And those T cells they are just interact directly with those non-self foreign antigen. They will be directly destroying those antigens. So that's the difference. And question number 4, draw a graph of what would happen to the concentration of antibodies over time during the primary and secondary immune response. So this is the diagram I draw. So the y-axis is the concentration of the antibodies, and the x-axis is the time. So they were just showing how things are over time. So this is the point of initial exposure, and this would be the second exposure. So after the initial exposure, there will be a primary immune response. So this is just a, well, compared to this is the secondary immune response, and this is the first, the initial, the primary immune response. So compared to those, it's just a kind of, well, low amount antibody has been produced by B cells to this unknown pathogen, but they are just learning, they are just dealing with those pathogens, and they are just keep, well, accumulating informations on them, so they are just learning how to respond. So but after the initial exposure, when we are exposed again as a second exposure, but then the second immune response will be faster and way more effective, because, well, the memory B cells become really, already they have the information on what the pathogen it is, and they will be active more way faster, and they will deal with those antigen way effectively. So this is showing the high amount of concentration, high amount of antibody has been produced at the second exposure, after the second exposure. And question number 5, imagine you are interacting with someone who thinks that vaccinations are harmful and cause autism. Based on what you have learned about vaccines, explain how you would convince this person that vaccinations are beneficial. So this vaccination is just they just produce the, well, artificially acquired those immunity, so they are just the adaptive immunity as well. So vaccine has these antigens which is already weakened or inactive. So it doesn't really stimulate any, well, it doesn't really cause any symptoms. So, but even though it doesn't cause any symptoms, it's a first primary exposure, so they will stimulate the immune response without any symptoms. So when you just are exposed again, as a second exposure, those secondary response will be way faster. As I just already described in the question number 4. So the secondary immune response will be really faster and way more effective. So this is pretty safe way to provide the individual adaptive immunity. And another thing is another benefit is also there is a herd immunity, so which is the protection by high vaccination rate. So when enough people is immunized, or they are already immunized, while getting the vaccination against a certain disease, and there is no way, it is very difficult for those disease to get through the community. So there is no foothold. They can just build those paths to the community itself. They cannot really penetrate the community. So they just this thing, herd immunity, can provide the protection to people who cannot really get the immunization. Receive the vaccinations, like newborns or the elderly with pre-existing disease. So this vaccination doesn't really help the individuals. It is not only beneficial to the individual, but to the whole community. So this is pretty important. And question number 6, how does HIV interact with our immune system? So this HIV is the virus that infects our T cells, they will decrease the number of our T cells, and they are just weakening our immune system. So if we are exposed to this HIV virus for a long time, that will eventually lead to the AIDS, like immune deficiency syndrome. So then, yeah, it will cause this AIDS in eventually. So question number 7, why is it important to know the blood type of a patient before performing a blood transfusion? So there are like 4 types of blood. Well, so there are 4 blood types like A, B, AB, and O, and each of them has sets of antigens in the cell and antibodies in the plasma. So if we during the transfusion, if we just mismatch those bloods and the antigens, those antigens in the donated blood cells, donated red blood cells, and they will just react with the antigens in antibodies in the plasma of the recipient. So there will be a blood clots, and well, if our blood are clots, and it will just cause a lot of serious problems, and they can eventually lead to cause the death. So those will be seriously considered before the transfusion. And also there is another Rh factors, plus and minus. So they are also the kind of antigens should be checked before the transfusion. So they will they could influence the transfusion as well. So those ABO type and Rh factors should be checked before the transfusion.